All right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to Share Screen Africa's Raptor Education Series with your host, me, Kalen Padiachi from the KNAV Conservation Foundation. It is our penultimate episode for this series, which is kind of sad, but not to worry. Leadership for Conservation in Africa has a brand new podcast launching on the 7th of November called The Flight Against Extinction, which is a journey through the diverse natural habitats in our world and a spotlight on the challenges they face. Produced by Leadership for Conservation in Africa. Habitat loss and habitat degradation have a massive impact on our fauna and flora. And in this series, we explore the impact on our feathered friends. World-renowned experts join Lisma Finzel to discuss the challenges and present some of the solutions to these problems. We highlight the plight of birds facing a very uncertain future, such as vultures, white-winged flufftails, and of course, our African penguins. So there are many more series coming up in the next few months that are going to be very exciting and have to do specifically with birds. So I hope to see you all there for the launch of this podcast on the 7th of November. But let's get back to our Raptor series. We'll be speaking to a few of our Raptor experts again. Our headline speaker for tonight, of course, is Simon Tomset. Most of you would recognize Simon as our tour guide, our esteemed tour guide for the virtual tours we've been having on this series. But tonight we are very lucky and very fortunate to have him here in person. He's going to be speaking to us live from Kenya about Africa's fastest flyers, which of course are our Falcons and Kestrels. After chatting to Simon, we're going to head all the way over to the beautiful island of Mauritius, where we're going to catch up with Dr. Vikash Tataya. And he's going to be speaking to us about a very precious little raptor, which of course is the Mauritian kestrel. Another success story, conservation success story for the African continent. After we catch up with Vikash, we're going to then open up the doors for our audience to chat to us a little bit about the questions that have been burning since the last time we saw each other last week. And of course, guys, for those of you that have missed a few of the episodes in the series, or you just want to catch up on the episodes that you've missed, or you just want to see, you want to see some of those episodes that you've enjoyed the most, jump onto Share Screen Africa's website and visit the presentations tab, and you'll be able to find all the the recordings from our last episodes. I'm also getting a message here. We have a field trip as well planned. So there is going to be another field trip where Simon's going to speak to us about the Falcons and Kestrels in Kenya as well. So we got that to look forward to. And of course, if you guys remember, every Wednesday at around 7:30, we South African time, of course, we send out those Raptor education posters. So keep an eye out on the email that you used to register for tonight's talk. We are going to be sending them to that email. As soon as you get them, share them far and wide. They are completely copyright free, so you can print them, use them, share them however you like. That is how we are going to spread the word about conservation of Africa's raptors. All right, perfect. So without any further ado, I think let's catch up with Simon Tomset. Simon is, of course, our esteemed tour guide for the series. And he is also the recipient of the prestigious 2023 Partners for Raptors Lifetime Achievement Award. Quite a mouthful. That's amazing. Well done there, Simon. And so that shows his dedication to to conservation, but also specifically the conservation of raptors in Africa. His knowledge and experience with these birds are second to none, and we are very fortunate to have him speaking to us live tonight from Kenya. So with that, Simon, completely, that's over to you.
Well, thank you very much for a great introduction. I'm extremely lucky to get the creme de la creme of all the raptors, which are the falcons. So there's a fantastic picture of a Lana falcon that's nesting about 1.5 kilometers from my house in Soisambu. I'm very lucky. The Lana falcons nested there a couple of years ago and had 3 chicks, but only thanks to some conservation management. What I will do is just rattle through what is actually a lot of raptors, 22 falcons in all. And we're trying to get to the next thing. Cool. So they are, yes, the most incredible of the hunters. They're the fastest of the lot. There's a picture here of the iconic peregrine taking a pigeon. I suspect either in England somewhere, just because of the type of pigeon it's taking. And on the left there is an amur, actually a juvenile, taking termites. And we'll talk about amurs later. So falcons in general, what separates a falcon from the other birds of prey? Well, actually, kind of embarrassingly, they're more related to parrots, really, than the rest of the raptors. The tighter falcon there obviously is shaped like a bullet. It's a massively heavy chest, really quite small wings and small tail, and evidently looks like a falcon, and it's very different from the African harrier hawk, which is a gangly, long-legged, double-jointed bird, or the low wing-loaded jackal buzzard, or the monstrous martial eagle. But you can see that the tighter really is built for speed, and curiously, you can see the length of the middle toe of the tighter is not as long as you would expect for a bird hunter. We'll go into that a little later. So what makes a falcon a falcon? Well, they all have bare tarsus, but so do a lot of other raptors. They have, in the illustration on the top right, a notch in the upper mandible. This also has a notch in the lower mandible. And they have the famously round nostril with a bony protrusion in the middle of the nostril. And the eye is usually brown. There are a few exceptions. And forward of the eye, it's actually quite naked with a bare patch that goes onto the lores and onto the cere. And the bottom there is a sort of an attempt to do some drawings and paintings of a kestrel, rather rufusy, reddish bird. And you can see they have a moustachial stripe or malar stripe. And they have pale ear coverts, most of them, covering a rather sort of a dark frame of the head or the rufus of the falcons. And on the bottom and in the middle there, you can see what is an attempt to do a hobby. It's emphasizing the fact that hobbies have, in effect, what looks like 2 moustachial stripes. And above that is a juvenile Lana, and then there's the diminutive little pygmy falcon, again with the round nostril, brown eye, notches in both mandibles, but lacking in a moustache, maybe because it's too small to have a moustache. Otherwise, it really is a small falcon. And a photograph shows you the very pronounced teeth, 2 notches on either side of the bill that's used by falcons, large falcons, to break birds' necks, but for small falcons, usually to take the hard shells off insects. So in Africa, we venerated falcons for thousands of years, and Horus is the sun god in Egypt, and many people variously think that Horus is actually a peregrine or even a Lana, but it really does look like the Barbary falcon, which nests nearby and even in Cheops. So in my opinion, I think that Horus is actually a Barbary falcon. So Africa hosts some 22 falcons, some of which are migrant, and they range in size from the diminutive little pygmy falcon, and there is a subadult Lana, and all of them have, the falcons other than the pygmy falcon, have thin tapered wings, which enable them to fly at extremely high speeds. And interestingly and confusingly for identification, the first year of peregrines and large falcons like Lanas and Sakers often have longer flight feathers, such as their primary and tail feathers, So they actually have a slightly lower wing loading than the adult. And they decrease the length of their primaries and tail feathers steadily up until 2 years, actually. So they become more heavily wing loaded and much faster at flying. So we're going to break up the falcons into basically kestrels, and then the hobbies, and then the large falcons. I don't really want this presentation to be just an identification help. I'll go through each species and talk about the various problems they face. So what I like to call red kestrels is basically those kestrels that are predominantly red or rufous. And then I'll talk about the gray ones, which are obviously the gray kestrel and the Dickinsons. And I'll proceed on to the large falcons, but it's a nice way to split them up. But red kestrels really are quite closely related to one another. And the one that sets the scene is the common kestrel, which migrates down certainly into our part of Kenya and Tanzania and sets up shop, whilst all the lesser kestrels migrate further on. And they often look to be resident, even defending their trees that they stay in. So common kestrels are actually quite common. And you may find quite a few hundred within quite a few thousand square kilometers, but they are there permanently during the winter period. And our version of the common kestrel here in Eastern Africa, and it stretches all the way across into Western Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, is the mountain kestrel. And this is a photograph we took on the southern Kenya border on the right of a juvenile. And there's a photograph there of a male and female meeting one another and changing food. Actually quite different from the common kestrel. Certainly the East African one appears to have a much longer tail and a shorter wing, and is built more of an accipitrine way than most kestrels. The Southern African version is the rock kestrel, which is remarkably common compared to the mountain kestrel in East Africa, and found even on nesting on buildings, I hear, but it can occupy really quite dry habitats. It doesn't seem to have the same shape as our mountain kestrel. It just is more of a regular looking kestrel. We move on to the lesser kestrel, which migrates still in their thousands throughout Africa, and they come through Eastern Africa sometimes in many thousands, and are often accompanied by hobbies and the moor falcons. Here they will suddenly descend, sitting in gum trees, literally in their hundreds. And I'm sure that's a similar situation in South Africa as well. I hear that they're quite prone to being killed by hailstorms. And here they certainly are extremely at risk of poisoning of locusts, which we do all over Northern Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. Is certainly one of the few things that we haven't really addressed, which is the poisoning of prey species such as locusts and red-billed quail. They certainly fall victim to that. Another red kestrel, basically because it's red and it hovers, is the greater kestrel. It's much larger than the lesser kestrel. It's actually pretty good at catching birds. The one on the right there has actually caught a small lark. And oddly, is one of the few falcons with a pale eye. They're born, however, in the first year with a brown eye, as is the picture on the left. And they nest in takeover crow's nests, and here seen on top of an old telegraph pole, I'm sure in southern Africa. It's a species that sometimes congregates together, and especially in the northern deserts here in Kenya, you're sometimes a bit surprised to see groups up to a dozen all hunting together. It's a species that really is understudied in our region, evidently more studied in southern Africa. And then there's the fox kestrel, and that really is a species that does need to be studied. It's a long-tailed, rather bizarre-looking kestrel. Some adults have quite a pale eye, The one there on the right is actually taken right only 2 kilometers from my house on the cliff where the lanner nests. And if we're trying to look for indicators of climate change, we're definitely seeing much more fox kestrels, which are arid landscape, semi-desert dwelling falcons moving further south. Where I live in the Central Rift Valley, it really is quite unusual to see fox kestrels, and I saw one here just 2 days ago. So perhaps that's an indication of climate change. Then we move on to the grey kestrels, and in many ways it's a misnomer to call these kestrels at all. So famously, the grey kestrel is obviously one of them, and then the Dickinson's kestrel as well. The grey kestrel we have here in Kenya, stretching all the way from Ethiopia. It kind of likes the wetter Guinea savannas as well. It's supposed to be just a lizard specialist because of extremely strong laterally compressed bill. But actually, we've seen them take waders. They have extremely stiff primaries, rather like a peregrine does. They're not soft at all like the red kestrels, and they have quite a strong foot. So although, yes, they're probably well adapted for taking thick-skinned reptiles, they definitely take quite a lot of birds. And then the Dickinson's kestrel seems to be a less aggressive version of it. This photograph was taken in Pemba Island, where there's an enormous number of Dickinson's kestrels for some reason. Now we move on to the hobby group. And here is the classic long-winged, fairly long-tailed, but remarkably long-winged falcons that are tireless in flight. And there's a good photograph here showing you them nesting in a gum tree. And certainly they are nesting in gum trees and old crow nests in Ethiopia up to about 11,500 feet. It's an odd species given the fact that we can't really identify the areas that it favors the most. In West Africa and Ivory Coast, I've seen them in very wet Guinea savannas with palm trees. And yet in the highlands of Ethiopia, you see them in dry, desolate highlands. In Kenya, we see them dotted all over the place when nothing specifically gives you an indication of where you're going to find African hobbies. The one in the middle there is a juvenile. They are much more polymorphic than we tend to think. And the one with the red chest there is classically easily confused with the tighter falcon, except for the fact its wing shape, malar stripe, and head look nothing like the tighter falcon, and yet the color is very similar to it. This is the Eurasian hobby. The one on the right is a juvenile, and the one on the left is an adult. It's not really showing the ruddy rufous undertail that it should do, but it is an adult. We get these migrating through Kenya. Used to get them in their hundreds. Today they're getting considerably rarer. They're certainly much more common than the African hobby. And then within the hobby group, and genetically very closely related to them, is the sooty falcons and the Eleonoras. So the sooty, as the name suggests, is this completely dark, kind of slate gray falcon. And look at the length of that primary extending beyond its tail. These are incredibly fast falcons. We've had a few in for rehabilitation. They have massive pectoral mass on their chests. Their wing beat is stronger than most of the hobby group, and it can accelerate incredibly quickly. These species nest in the middle of some of the harshest deserts in Tunisia and Libya, literally just under a rock in the blazing sun, waiting for migrants. And then the Eleonoras nest on islands in the Mediterranean and on the northwest coast of Africa. And then they migrate all the way down through Africa, and then they end up in Madagascar. This is a rehab Eleonoras that we had that was actually ringed on an island off Spain. Was picked up here. we're lucky to have rescued it, and we thank a number of people for facilitating us to go and rescue it. But it was, unfortunately, because of it carrying massive rings, threatened by the fact that those rings were so big. And the curiosity that these rings raise with local people is can end with the species being killed. It's often retained as a curiosity value, and we're very lucky to have had many people come to its rescue. It was good to rear it and then release it. We had to do that very quickly because the turnaround period was short. And the one in the bottom middle there is a juvenile one, showing you the sort of odd turtle scallop shapes that they have on their feathers. An extremely large hobby, and again, strictly a bird hunter. So we go on to the large falcons, and this is a picture of a Lanner falcon in full stoop. It's evidently just had a bath. As you can see, its tail is damp. And they include the peregrine falcon, the Barbary falcon, and I want to include the Taita falcon. The Taita falcon is an honorary large falcon. It's very closely related to the peregrine, and it, although it's tiny, we want to include it with the large falcons. So the peregrine has been recorded at about 320 kilometers an hour, about 200 miles an hour. I have no doubt that that is true. I wouldn't be surprised it can reach higher speeds, but they don't really need to fly that fast to kill their prey. But so is the Barbary falcon, capable of this incredible speed, as is the Taita falcon. So these are the classic falcons. They're incredible animals. Some people tend to have a soft spot for them. They have been used by humans for many thousands of years for falconry. We emerged from the Dark Ages with them sitting on our fists. I'm extremely fond of them, not because of their falconry value, but because they just seem to summarize the wilderness. Wherever you may see a peregrine, be it in a city or on a cliff overlooking the sea or an inland cliff in the desert, their very call is like the call of the wilderness. They really are incredible. When they fly, they look like Superman at top speed. Just incredible animals, as is the Barbary. And we're extremely lucky in Kenya to have all of these, including the Barbary. And our Barbary is the most extreme of the lot, being the smallest of the lot, so tiny that one specimen was put in a cabinet along with the hobbies. They're that tiny in this part of Kenya and in Yemen and on the Horn of Africa. They're extremely small, but with massive pectoral mass. They would be incapable of breeding with the Moroccan or the Cape Verde Barbaries, very different in size. And here's a rather pale Taita falcon, much paler than what people think. It's a nice photograph. The Lanner falcon in stoop on the left, it is certainly less heavily wing-loaded than the peregrine, Barbary, or Taita falcon. It is still a master at stooping, may not stoop as fast, but they're incredibly efficient hunters. The adult, well, just adult male sitting on the rock there. And then there's the juvenile Lanner on the top right there with the streaks beneath. And then there's a picture of both male and female Lanner sitting side by side. This is a species that concerns me greatly in our region, as does the peregrine. There is no question that both are in rapid decline. I have visited South Africa and been to the Cape and talked to Andrew Jenkins and been amazed at the numbers of peregrines that they have there and the paucity of peregrines and Lanners that we today have in Kenya. I don't know if this is true elsewhere in Africa, and those listening, please look out for and take great attention to the large falcons. There is no question that they have declined in our region. For example, I used to know 27 peregrine nest sites in the early 80s, and by the end of the 80s, none of those were existent. I've just been 2 weeks ago to look for peregrines in old haunts in the National Park of the Aberdares to find that they are not nesting there, and other famous nests that we knew of are also vacant. We're desperately looking for active peregrine nests as well as lanner nests. We have no idea why they are in decline, but pesticides is obviously strongly suspected. Now we're moving on to the red-footed falcon. And this is not really a hobby. It does seem to look like a hobby. It's basically a falcon, no clear lineage to which it is related, probably more related to kestrels. They have red feet. They also have a red cere and a red eye ring. And the red-footed male has the dark underwing coverts. And the female is kind of a bit of a redhead. She's got quite literally a reddish hue to her head, as well as her chest and the underwing coverts. These tend to migrate and go down through the western side of Africa. For us in Kenya, they're much less common than the Amur falcon. So this is the Amur. The adult male is the one with the white underwing coverts, and then there's females to the left and right, and then a juvenile above. And yes, they can migrate through our region again in their hundreds and thousands. We've seen what appears to be a decline, but we're not too sure. Now, this is the merlin, a species I've never encountered, although I may have seen one in Ethiopia. If that's the case, it'd be a unique record. They do nest in Morocco, and they do occasionally enter into Egypt. But otherwise, for us, it's a species that does occur in Africa. Good to put on this list, but it's one I don't think occurs south of the Sahel. And then we have the red-necked falcon. This actually is more closely related to the large falcon, like the peregrine, than it is to kestrels. It is incredibly tough. Can kill birds up to the size of cattle egrets. They can kill doves, and they're often seen at the waterholes in the Kalahari, hunting alongside with shikras and gabar goshawks, catching quelea. These are also in decline, possibly because of in our region, a rather ridiculous reason, which is the cutting down of palm trees for wine. It would seem a pity to lose species because of alcohol. But they do occur in southern Africa in crow's nests and camel thorn, and they're certainly doing better in that region than they are in ours. Not sure about the status in West Africa, but I suspect that they're quite healthy there too. Our peregrine, the African peregrine, is considerably smaller than the Calidus peregrine, the Russian, Siberian, Arctic peregrine that visits us. We actually do have the nominate race visit us on occasion, Peregrinus peregrinus, and you can see the difference in size. Well, not so much size, but in color. The pale Calidus falcon on the post there is considerably paler than the African peregrine, which has a rather different wing shape as well. The Calidus is more likely wing-loaded, much, much larger, and will migrate all the way down to southern Africa. And we do, unfortunately, see a few individuals on our rice fields here where people deliberately kill birds, and they're tens of thousands using carbamate poisons. And they're definitely some of the killing fields for the Calidus peregrine, no doubt, are in Western Kenya and on rice-growing fields in Africa. Again, we go back onto the Barbary falcon, and then we move on rapidly to the Taita falcon. So these are a couple of pictures of Taitas, going over them again. Looks similar and is genetically quite closely related to the peregrine. The one on the bottom left there was actually quite interesting. That bird we saw in Savo many years ago. It put its wings out and sat there beginning to flap it, and then looked up skyward. And up in the sky was a whole load of migratory European swifts. And it sat there beating its wing on that dead post, on the dead tree there, and then decided to take off. And it climbed up at 45-degree angles, straight out. We wouldn't have seen it if we hadn't had powerful binoculars, and then started to chase the swifts, which were flying very high up, out of sight. And I have no doubt, as it was chasing one down, that it probably killed it. They're quite capable of initiating a flight from a tree straight up into the sky to take their prey. They're not focused just on swifts. They actually would seem to be much more interested in taking very peripatetic inter-African migrant finches and weavers, such as qualia. When they are in profusion, you suddenly see the appearance of tighter falcons. And we're back onto the pygmy falcon again. There are two populations, one in Eastern Africa to Ethiopia, and then one in Southern Africa. And it would appear to me that the Southern African one is slightly paler and slightly larger. So some of the falcons are capable of the most incredible migrations. The lesser kestrel we're familiar with, both here in Kenya and in Southern Africa, migrating all the way from Spain, all the way across the Sahara, presumably. But the ones that are most famous really are the Amur falcon, and they migrate. And this photograph in the background here is actually showing you a picture, I'm sure, in Nagaland, where tens of thousands of Amurs congregate before they get to the sort of the southern tip of India to make their migration across the Indian Ocean. Unfortunately, they were trapped in their tens of thousands there too for food. Gruesome images of people, children holding dozens of them still alive together for them to be cooked. Fortunately, because of those images, there's now a good conservation program to stop that happening. So this is the movement that the Amur does. It sits looking across the Japanese Sea, where it shares its land with the Amur leopard and tiger, and one can see that it flies right across down the eastern side of India, across India, and then does that incredible Indian Ocean crossing to hit the Horn of Africa and Somalia, and then goes through Kenya, Tanzania, and down into southern Africa. It's an incredible migration, and in and obviously encountering incredible threats, in particular the spraying of desert locusts and qualia. This is another migration. The one on the left is a peregrine migrating all the way from Saudi across the Red Sea, down through Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and down into southern Africa, right to the Cape. An incredible crossing. And the Eleonoras too, showing you 6 juveniles as they migrated from an island off Spain down through, right through the center heart of the Sahara, hitting Western Africa and going across the forests to East Africa, and then of course crossing into Madagascar where they overwinter. So it pretty much sums up how incredible the falcons are, and just want to say thank you very much. Had to go through that quite quickly and go through some of the status and some of the conservation issues facing them today. But thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Simon, for that extremely interesting presentation. Falcons are definitely one of those that group that captivates the minds of many individuals. I think from there, let's take a trip over to Mauritius to meet with Dr. Vakash Tatayal, who will speak to us about another falcon species, kestrel species in that or on that specific island.
So I'm going to tell you the wonderful story of the Mauritius kestrel, which is a bird that almost went extinct and has been saved from extinction and is now the national bird of the Republic of Mauritius. You can see on the screen a beautiful photo of this small-sized falcon, which is endemic to Mauritius, so unique to the island of Mauritius. So we believe that before men arrived on Mauritius, which is an island which is 1,865 kilometers square, that there were up to around 4,000 Mauritius kestrels. And it was part of this beautiful ecosystem that survived here without any invasive predatory mammals. And if you're trying to find out where the kestrel is right now, well, it's here. It's sitting here on this branch here. And I mentioned that there was the harrier This is the harrier, which is no longer found on Mauritius, but is still alive and threatened on nearby Réunion Island. Now, it's amidst this wonderful ecosystem of plants, animals, that the kestrel was also doing what it does as a top predator in the ecosystem. Unfortunately, men arrived to Mauritius in the 1500s, and first the Dutch, then the French, then the British, and then we eventually became independent. But with every successive colonization and period of our history, land would be cleared to make way for agriculture, in particular, sugarcane. So you can see here the different years and how land was being chopped down. And with every loss of forest, the habitat of the Mauritius kestrel was declining. By 1997, we believe there were less than 5% of a native forest left on Mauritius, of which less than 2% was forest of good quality, that is having a high proportion of endemic plants. And today we believe that this area has gone down further, and that is down to 1.3% of good quality native habitat. And it's mostly in those habitats on the southeast of Mauritius and the southwest of Mauritius that the Mauritius kestrel is having to survive. The Mauritius kestrel would have gone extinct and would have joined a host of other plants and animals that have also gone extinct on Mauritius. And you can see some of these. For example, the red rail, the 2 species of tortoises, the blue pigeon, 2 fruit bats that have gone extinct, the large parrot of Mauritius has gone extinct, and the giant skink of Mauritius. And more than 30 other species have gone extinct from Mauritius. The most famous of these extinctions is the dodo. And we somewhat say that the birth of conservation in the world was with the dodo, because it was for the first time that after the disappearance of the dodo, that mankind realized that he could drive species to extinction. So the birthplace of conservation for us is really Mauritius through the dodo. And as I mentioned before, the Mauritius kestrel would also have joined the dodo. It was down to just 4 known wild individuals at the time that it was surveyed by somebody who's still alive called Professor Stanley Temple, who was sent over by Professor Tom Cade from the Peregrine Fund. And there was at that time only a single known breeding female. So a captive breeding program was started, but also in the wild, we did have to contend with a number of introduced mammals, such as rats, introduced monkeys from Southeast Asia, monkeys that kill chicks, especially young fledglings that spend a lot of time on the ground, but also introduced cats. But one of the biggest problems in the 1900s was the use of organochlorides and organophosphates, especially DDT, from after the Second World War to around 1980, used over a large scale to control malaria, and which had impacted on the Mauritius kestrel, in particular eggshell thinning, abnormal embryo development, and what we now understand are the impacts of DDT on raptors. And this was happening to our Mauritius kestrel as well. And it was around that time that the Mauritius kestrel declined to very low numbers that Norman Myers would write in his book, The Sinking Ark. We might abandon the Mauritius kestrel to its all but inevitable fate and utilize the funds to proffer stronger support for any of the hundreds of threatened bird species that are more likely to survive. So a proportion of the scientific community had already written off the Mauritius kestrel. And thankfully, there were a small number of people out there who were stubborn and still believed that the Mauritius kestrel could be saved, one of them being Professor Carl Jones, who I'll mention later on. So around that time, there were a number of scientists that harvested eggs from the last wild pairs, and set up a captive breeding program for the Mauritius kestrel. So brought adults into captivity, hatch young eggs in captivity, raise young ones, and then release them into the wild. And here you can see kestrels being released from nest boxes that were purposefully designed to be long, so that the length of the nest box will be longer than the arm of a monkey. And this provision of nest boxes has been very successful, and to this day, most of the kestrels are breeding in nest boxes that we provide them. They can also use natural rock cavities, and they can use cavities in trees, but these are becoming rare and the quality is highly variable. And we found that managing them in nest boxes such as this one is easier from a management point of view. And now we've started making those in PVC, which are more durable, lighter, and also lighter and more durable are what we're looking for. Now, when we release kestrels into the wild, we look at them after a certain while until the kestrels are able to fend for themselves. Nearly all the kestrels are ringed, individually color ringed, and have metal rings, which we get from the University of Cape Town, SAF ring. And we are able to have a very strong data set, which is allowing us to understand the impact of bottlenecking, and seeing following parentage, looking at diseases, not that there are any of concern. And so we have a very good handle on the Mauritius kestrels. And Professor Tom Cade, who passed away a few years ago and who was the founder of the Peregrine Fund, recognized that the Mauritius kestrel project was the most successful raptor restoration project in the world. Now, we look after eggs in the wild. We have a close monitoring of all the birds. We are looking at effects of climate change. We are looking at effects of inbreeding. So we keep a very close tab on our birds to this day. And in an independent publication by BirdLife entitled "How Many Bird Extinctions Have We Prevented?", there were 31 birdie species which were recognized to have been saved during the period 1984 to 2004 that would certainly have disappeared. 5 of these 31 birds are from Mauritius and Rodrigues, and foremost of these is the Mauritius kestrel. So Mauritius has saved more birds from extinction than any other country in the world, and we continue to work on the Mauritius kestrel. It's a species that is going to require long-term support, especially nest box provisioning, and captive breeding, captive rearing, and releases in areas to sustain numbers. So we continue working very actively on the Mauritius kestrel. We currently have around 350 birds in the wild. It is currently considered as endangered. We are working to getting it back to vulnerable, because at one point it had gone over 500 and was considered as vulnerable. There's been a decline on the west of Mauritius, which we're trying to address by putting up nest boxes and by releasing captive reared birds into the wild, and we are actively doing that currently. So the saving of the Mauritius kestrel wasn't an end in itself, because the kestrel has been very important in helping to designate the first national park of Mauritius, the Black River Gorges National Park. In 1993, we argued, or we proposed to the government of Mauritius that besides saving the kestrel, we had to save its habitat. And this was music to the ears of the then Prime Minister of Mauritius, who, with lightning speed, forged ahead and declared the Black River Gorges as a national park. So the Mauritius kestrel has actually been a mascot or a reason to actually designate protected areas on Mauritius. And it's also helped to drive other work on species conservation. So the success of Mauritius kestrel has encouraged work on saving other habitats, and other species, such as the pink pigeon, which you can see here, but also driving ecosystems restoration thinking, even in places where the kestrel is not found. And it also goes to show that conservation can work. And in a world of doom and gloom, where we keep hearing of species going down and meeting extinction, the Mauritius kestrel, which was down to 4 individuals, including a single breeding female, is is an example of, it's never too late. However, we shouldn't wait for birds to get down to such low numbers before we start acting or reacting. And it's very important also to re-highlight how saving a species can become iconic and also save actually ecosystems and also support other conservation works. So in 2021, I'm here with the crutches at a ministerial visit to our captive breeding center in Black River. I proposed to the ministers, including senior ministers who you can see there on that picture, I proposed to them that the Mauritius kestrel be made the national bird. The idea was not my own. It was an idea that had been proposed by Carl Jones a decade earlier. Carl Jones is this young Welsh lad who had been brought to Mauritius in 1979 to work on the kestrels and actually turned a project which was fading into a successful project. So he's well renowned for having saved a lot of birds from extinction. And he had made the wish that the kestrel become the national bird, because at that time, although Mauritius did not have a formal national bird, everybody thought it was the dodo, which is an extinct species. The idea to make the Mauritius kestrel a national bird was unanimously agreed, went through at lightning speed through our parliament. Within a few weeks, it was agreed. And on Independence Day of 2022, just a few months after I made this proposal, the Mauritius kestrel became the national bird. Now, we have to be careful in that a number of people were proposing other endemic birds of Mauritius to be the national bird. And some were even thinking that the red-tailed tropic bird, which is a native seabird, but which you find throughout the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean islands, they were preferring those other species to become the national bird. And some preferred the tropic bird, the red-tailed tropic bird, because it's also the symbol of Air Mauritius, our national airline. And a lot of people, as I mentioned, really thought that the dodo should be the national bird. And it's quite prominent in our society, whether you're talking of birds or flip-flops or matches sticks, safety matches or whatever not. And there were also other people who thought some of these introduced birds to Mauritius should be the national bird, which we of course opposed vehemently. And we thought that we should actually be choosing success, a bird associated with success and thriving biodiversity over the other species that some people were thinking about. And the Mauritius kestrel was the ideal candidate because several organizations on Mauritius were already using the kestrel as in their logos, including ourselves. And it represented beauty, pride, majesty, survivorship, determination. And of course, it had been a flagship for conservation. And many raptors were actually used as the national bird of countries, some of which I've listed here. So it made perfect sense to try to promote the Mauritius kestrel as the national bird. So in effect, for our 54th independence anniversary and the 30th Republic of Mauritius anniversary, the Mauritius kestrel was made the national bird. We had produced pamphlets which we sent out in schools. We produced T-shirts and tote bags. There was a special commemorative issue, a stamp issue that was launched on that day. And then there was a formal logo that was unveiled by the Prime Minister and and the president of the Republic of Mauritius. So it was a big day for the Mauritius kestrel, which became the national bird of Mauritius. Now, we would like to try to work further because this is the coat of arms of Mauritius, which shows the dodo, which, as we know, is extinct, which shows the deer, which has caused a lot of problems in our forests for destruction of plants and also soil erosion. And our coat of arms also has the sugarcane, which doesn't have the glory that it had in the past. We would like to see, the sugarcane also symbolizes a plant which has caused so much destruction, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. So we would like to gradually talk to government to see whether we can have a more forward-looking and positive-looking coat of arms by having the black ebony and the latania of Mauritius and the national flower, which is the Trochetia butoniana, and having a fruit bat and a kestrel. So something which is more in line with the success in conservation that we have been able to achieve on Mauritius. It's a political exercise that we will do. And it's interesting that Rodrigues, which is an island that is part of Mauritius, has adopted a coat of arms which includes native species such as the hibiscus liliflorus, which is an endemic hibiscus of Rodrigues, the Rodrigues warbler, which is an endemic bird that almost went extinct as well. And yes, it does include an extinct bird, which is the solitaire, but it's more in line with modern conservation thinking. And I sadly must say that our coat of arms that is currently there has got something of a retrograde colonial past, which I think Mauritius should try to overcome. And hopefully we'll be able to get the kestrel integrated into the coat of arms. And to conclude, it's such a beautiful bird. It's a bird with such a beautiful story, cling back from the grips of extinction. And it's such a better symbol of conservation and conservation working and going forward. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. And I hope you appreciated this talk about the Mauritius kestrel. And if you do come to Mauritius, please get in touch and we'll advise on where are the best places and times of the year to see the Mauritius kestrel. Thank you.
Fantastic. And thank you very much to Dr. Vikash for that presentation. It's always good to hear a success story in amongst our conservation nightmares. So very good to hear from him on that species. Now it's off to East Africa to visit with Simon Thompson once again.
Africa has as many as 15 small falcons, 16 if you include the pygmy falcon. They're split into kestrels and hobbies. The kestrels are rather poorly defined group, mostly red, rufusy, coloured, small falcons with small feet that hover, and both the sexes differ in their colour of their plumage and not so much in size. There is the common kestrel, a breeder in Eurasia and North Africa that migrates all the way down through much of the western and eastern part of northern Africa, and they occur in quite large numbers, in particular in Kenya and Tanzania. They're overshadowed often by the enormity of thousands of lesser kestrels with which they migrate. Common kestrels tend to settle, take up small residence in a tree, defend it, almost make one feel as though they are residents. Lesser kestrels continue all the way down to southern Africa and fly around catching insects, particularly termites and locusts. Of the two resident breeding kestrels, we have the mountain kestrel and the rock kestrel. The rock kestrel is found in much more arid areas in southern Africa. The larger white-eyed kestrel, or sometimes called greater kestrel, is, as the name suggests, quite a bit bigger and differs in being able to hunt birds. All of these frequently hover which is one of the main ways to identify them. There are two other kestrels, called the grey and the Dickinson's kestrel, that are not really closely related to the red kestrels at all. The grey kestrel in particular is more robust, has a very thick laterally compressed bill and strong foot, in theory adapted for taking lizards and thick-skinned animals. However, it is also very active in flight, has rather stiff primaries, very fast indeed, and quite capable of taking small waders, if we've seen. The Dickinson's kestrel is a much less ambitious version of the grey kestrel. Of the kestrels, there are a number which are isolated to the islands offshore, such as Mauritius, Seychelles and Madagascar. There are enormous numbers of kestrels in Africa. Of the hobbies, there are the red-footed, Amur, Eleonora's, sooty, Eurasian hobby, and African hobby. And here we loosely include the red-footed falcons. These are incredibly swift, again tireless flyers, but with a long middle toe and are really designed to catch small birds. The Eurasian hobby migrates down each year in quite reasonable numbers. It is the typical hobby. It also hunts famously dragonflies, which is very much part of their food here in Kenya, and they fly all the way down to sort of the middle of southern Africa. The African hobby is a much darker, smaller version, reddish on the front, has two morphs, and it is a rather oddly placed bird in the sense that we don't really know where its favorite habitat is. In Western Africa, it can occur in quite low, humid Guinea forests, and no such place exists in East Africa, but it can occur up to 11,000 feet on cold plateaus in the Ethiopian highlands. In Kenya, it's rather distributed to both the hot areas of the central Nyanza Basin and also into some of the higher areas such as the eastern slopes of Kilimanjaro. Really a species of which we know very little about still. And then we move on to the red-necked falcon, which should not really be placed in the small falcon group. It is genetically much more related to the peregrine groups, and that is an extremely fast, aggressive little hunter. It has a very close relation in India, of which is been recently separated, but they're certainly extremely closely related. And then there is the pygmy falcon, an endearing tiny little falcon, closely related to another falcon previously called the Fieldens falconet, again in Far Asia. The East African one and the Southern African one tend to differ. The Southern African one certainly looks a bit paler and larger, and it's an extremely aggressive little bird despite its tiny size. It also takes small birds as well, but is mostly confined, of course, to eating much smaller things such as small geckos, insects and lizards. That completes the small falcons of Africa, but it needs to be emphasized that Africa really has the major bulk of kestrels to be found globally. Why? Nobody knows. This is the Eleonora's that came from Spain. She looks a bit short-winged because she hasn't grown in the first three primaries. As you can see on her back, she's still got some moth-eaten feathers from her first year. Otherwise, she's looking gorgeous with a blue face and yellow feet, which you expect to see from a female. This Eleonora's is sort of exactly the same as what you'd expect from the genus Falco. It's related, obviously, to the hobby group, having very much longer wings and long tail. Has, well, certainly in its first year, it had this sort of double moustachial stripe, which is that typical falcon stripe that looks straight down from the eye past the lip, and then behind it you can see a sort of a pale patch. On hobbies, usually behind the ears they have another pale patch. That falcon helmet is absolutely diagnostic. They also have brown eyes, most of them. I think there's only 3 in the world that have pale eyes, and you can see that she has a round nostril with a little island in the middle, and her bill is very neat with a very sharp, what's called a tomial tooth, which you can see very clearly.
That in theory is meant for breaking things necks, but I wouldn't be surprised that the evolution of that was to take off the hard outside cover of insects, really. Most of the falcons are tiny and eat a lot of insects. The foot's actually quite weird. I looked at this foot, haven't had opportunity to look at an Eleonoris as close as this before, but there are lots of fleshy pads on the underside of the outer toe, which I suspect is meant for grabbing onto their quite small avian prey. It's got quite a long middle toe. It's not exceptionally long. It's not such a bad grip. This thing surprises me by how strong it is. For the most part, falcons are supposed to give things a good walloping hit and then, stun things. But most of the hobbies actually tail chase and grab the things in midair without there being a strike past, like a peregrine or a lanner or a gyr. These things come up behind things and just grab them. Very, very swift flight. These things can take literally swifts and swallows, but for the most part, these sit on islands offshore, waiting for exhausted migrants to come in. Typical thing you see them with in paintings is things like hoopoes struggling across the ocean. And a hoopoe, my goodness, they fly extremely aerobatic. She, like all the other hobbies, highly migratory, very long wing, long tail, means that she has quite a light wing loading, despite actually having quite a strong sternum. These are much better built for long distance flying. So she will be flying all the way from Morocco right across the desert to come down through Kenya, down into Tanzania, and then move into Madagascar, which is where they spend their winter period before flying back, and then doing the journey in reverse all the way across the Sahara again. She came from Spain, was ringed in Spain, caused quite a stir here. She was supposed to be on her way to Madagascar, but there's no way she could have done so. She is actually quite a medium-sized falcon. Most of the kestrels, which are smaller and red birds with long tails and quite short wings, they hover. We got a lot of kestrels in Africa. In fact, I think we actually have more kestrels in Africa than any other place on Earth. Perhaps kestrels evolved here. Everybody's familiar with kestrels as being, the red-fronted small falcon. We do here get things like pygmy falcons, which are tiny, and they actually are, in my opinion, true falcons. They got their own genus at the moment. And then of course you got much bigger, like the peregrine, the lanner. I have a lanner here who actually, in terms of actual linear dimensions, is pretty similar to this, although about 3 times heavier. You can get ginormous peregrines, which are almost 1.5 kilograms. We have migratory ones that come through here from Russia. They're absolutely totally different compared to our very small African peregrines, which the males of which occasionally only weigh about, say, 450 grams. So they're very variable as a group.
Fantastic. Thank you once again, Simon, for that up-close look with those amazing birds. Perfect. So we've come to the part of the night which I enjoy the most, which is speaking to our audience members. So for those of you that have or are joining for the first time, you're welcome to ask your questions now. How we do it is, if you want to ask the question live, you just raise your hand. And how you do that is, at the bottom of your screen, there's a reactions button. When you click that reactions button, there's a raise hand function. Raise your hand and we'll get to you. When we spot your hand, we'll ask you to unmute and ask your questions. If you don't want to ask live, that's fine. You can type it in on the chat, and then we'll find your questions there. But I do see there is already a raised hand from Londiwe. Londiwe, go ahead. Unmute yourself and ask your questions.
Hi, Kellen. For me, it's not a question. It's just, Simon, Simon, thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'm a student, so it has been like I've been part of Birds of Prey since it has started. So, and your presentation and especially the field tours have been really informative and helpful with my studies. And it has been really a wonderful journey learning about different species, how they live and just how they survive, and like in their different ways. So thank you so much. Your work was very much appreciated. So thank you so much.
Well, thanks. Well, there's everybody else behind the scenes, I tell you, in front of the scenes. I've just been along for the ride. But no, I've learned a lot. I've just been learning a lot about the Mauritius Kestrel too. And there's some incredible presentations here.
And for those of you that didn't know, Londiwe is actually one of our assistants behind the scenes. She's one of the people that make this series possible. So, Londi, thank you so much for all your help and all your assistance. So I'm glad you've gotten something out of the series too.
Thank you.
And I see Corin. Corin, you've got your hand up. Go for it. Ask your question.
This is
Hello.
It's my sister, everybody. My apologies. Yeah. Come on, Karen, what do you want to say?
I wanted to know about that Eleanor's falcon. You said something about the rings being part of the problem as to why it had ended up. Sorry, that's my food. Why did it not in your care? And did you take the rings off, or did you let it fly off with those rings?
Yeah, good question. A bit of an embarrassing question. Certainly the rings were much larger than what we allow in this part of the world. They're big and they're colored, and they raise an enormous amount of curiosity from everybody. They think they're valuable. They thought they were gold. And really, it's certainly the amount of drag it would have caused. And there were big pieces of grit stuck between the ring and the leg. And some of these plastic rings are really not the right thing to do. So we took them off, and we replaced them with a tiny Kenyan ring, a single ring. Don't really need to have two rings, and accepting the fact you're not going to be able to see the number from a distance. You really can't expect to see colored rings and numbers on a tiny falcon from any range. So no, we got rid of those.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Karen. I appreciate that. Yeah, that was actually, Simon, that was something I picked up on as well when you mentioned the rings were the problem. I mean, rings are obviously a very important part of raptor research throughout the world. Were these rings, you say they were too large? Were they part of an official ringing scheme from Spain, or why were these put on? I mean, normally the guys from Europe are using good quality rings, and they're not causing such issues with these birds. Why do you think these rings were a particular problem, and why did they choose those particular rings?
Well, I didn't have any problem with the aluminium ring, although it could have been made much smaller. And really the rules are that if it covers most of the tarsus, especially the plastic one was large with numbers on it, and one assumes that people want to have large colored rings in order to tell the number from a distance. But there comes a point where you really can't, because the bird is so small. Therefore, you basically have to give up and just accept the fact that one little tiny ring may be very good on a bird for a post-mortem or something that's caught alive. But certainly every time we get ring birds here, be it a stork, the public often think it's worth something, and then it's retained. Then it has to go through authority, and there's a bureaucratic process that can take weeks, and in the interim, of course, the bird dies. That may not be the case in Europe, but it is often the case in this part of the world. And I think anybody working in Europe with birds that migrate into Africa have to take this into account. Yes, it's a little bit sensitive because there's a lot of concern about the size of backpacks. The new satellite backpacks. Some of them have massive trident antennas that stick out the back, which would make a good pitchfork design for catching material. And there are much better options, and I don't think enough attention has been made to making these things as least invasive as possible. That's the sort of definitely everybody's aware of that, and everybody's making much better equipment these days.
Yeah, definitely something we should be placing a lot more emphasis on. All right, thanks for that, Simon. So let's take a look at some of the questions in the chat. I see Inamisit, I hope I said that correctly. He wants to know why are they different colors, specifically peregrine. So I think he's referring to that portion of your talk that was speaking about the peregrines from different regions being slightly different colors, if I remember correctly.
Well, actually, I'm not too sure. I mean, why would the Calidus peregrine be much paler? Well, everybody would say, of course, because it comes from the cold, snowy Arctic. And you go, no, it doesn't. It actually evades the snow by coming down into Africa, and always has done. I find some of these the reasons a little bit odd. I mean, the old rules, you know, Bergman's Allens and other rules that don't really seem to apply if the bird is highly migratory and gets away from the cold climes. The African peregrine, I've seen an exceptional African peregrine near Lake Victoria that really was uniform slate gray on the front, all the way from its chin down to its tail, and it really looked almost black from close up, with hardly any barring at all. And so I've seen an individual in West Africa too, in Ivory Coast, that was extraordinarily dark, and some of them which are very red on the front, and some of which were almost inseparable from Barbary falcons by having, you know, rufous nuchal patches and eye spots on the back of the head. So they're incredibly variable in this part of the world. I was quite surprised to see that the Southern African Cape one was rather more sort of European looking. And I've definitely seen what anybody would say was a nominate race nesting in Ethiopia, the Peregrinus peregrinus, actually nesting in Ethiopia. So they're incredibly variable. It's not that easy to tell the races apart here.
All right, perfect. Inamisit also wants to know how does he become a part of the Mauritius Kestrel project? Can he work remotely? So unfortunately, I don't think Dr. Tataya is on online tonight, but he is. I mean, I've had an opportunity to meet him last year at a conference, and the Kestrel project in Mauritius is just amazing, the work they're doing, and they do take on people to help out with a lot of this work. So I think what we might do is actually put up a contact for the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation, and you can contact them directly if you want to get more involved, or you just want to learn more about obviously the Kestrel project, but they have many other wildlife programs running in Mauritius that's working on conserving what's left of Mauritius wildlife. So I think we'll put that up a little bit later in the chat. Just keep an eye out for that. We've got another question in the chat from Jared. Fantastic presentation and series. Thank you. My question for Simon: what is more important for raptor conservation? Helping these birds adapt to the changing environment, or maintaining the environments the birds thrive in? Wow, good question.
I think both. I definitely think that conservation management is long overdue. Listening to Vikash talk about a project in Mauritius, and I remember Carl Jones well, and the fact that you can actually turn things around. There's a lesson there for continental Africa. When we do have species that are so dire, they're literally down to the fingers of one hand, we're long overdue putting in real conservation management. I mean, captive breeding the lot. Other countries would have justified doing this decades ago with a similar situation that we face here in Kenya. Unfortunately, even if Kenya slid off into the Indian Ocean, nobody would really miss it, because the species occur elsewhere on the continent, and that's the wrong attitude. Certainly in Western Africa, there's a number of species that are critical. When it comes down to the forest species, we really don't know too much about them either. And again, I think what we really need to do is to facilitate research, remove much of the bureaucracy that gets in our way. Yeah, I mean, keep habitats, but also do conservation management. Education's great, but at the end of the day, we're going to be looking very shortly at a number of species that will become extinct on the continent unless we do actions.
Yeah, I think in recent time there has been a greater emphasis being placed on landscape type research and landscape type understanding more than just very specific species research. But I think you're right, Simon. It can't be either or, right? And I think Mauritius. It's a good thing that we had Vikash talking about the Mauritian Kestrel, because they're a good case to show that you can't have just one or the other. You need a good balance between the two. So yeah, thank you, Jared, for that question. Very, very good question. I'm just scanning over the the screen as we go. I don't see any other further questions. Are there any questions from the audience left? No, I think that's it from the audience for tonight. Everybody seems a little bit raptured out. Can never be too many raptors. No such thing. Well, I think that's a good point to wrap up our episode for tonight. Thank you again to our speakers. Simon, always a fantastic honor having you join us live. Thank you so much for taking the time. Vikash, unfortunately we couldn't get him here live, but he'll definitely be in touch. Anybody wants to get a hold of Vikash or the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation, their website has been put up in the chat. Link in, see what they're doing in their part of the world. Really, really great work on that side. Remember, next week, join us same time, same place, 7:30 South African time for our final episode of the series. Very, very sad. But with that being said, we are being joined by one of the legends in raptor conservation, Andre Botha. He's going to be speaking to us about raptors in general for a change. Anybody that knows Andre specializes in vultures in particular, but next week he's going to be giving us a much broader talk. Do not miss it. It is going to be amazing. So I look forward to seeing you all again next week, Wednesday. I see Holly is there. There's Holly, yes.
We've had a last minute addition to the Raptors series, and next week will not be the final talk. Next week will be the penultimate. And then we have a very exciting couple who will be talking on the Unlocking Nature platform on the following Thursday. And they run an NGO called Inglorious Bustards, and they work with protecting the flyways of migratory raptors into Africa. So that one will be the final one.
Oh, fantastic. That's great news. So penultimate episode next week, which is fantastic news. Excellent. Well then, with that, thank you all for joining. Simon, Vikash, very good having you guys. And until next time, have a great night. We'll see you soon.
Good night.